His name was Ham, just 3 letters, short and unremarkable. But behind that name was the first primate trained for spaceflight. Before Alan Shepard, before John Glenn, before the United States ever placed a human astronaut on the launch pad, Ham went first. But as the heavy steel hatch hissed shut on the 31st of January 1961, Ham wasn't thinking about history. He was a 3-year-old chimpanzee, sitting in a pressurized metal box bolted to the top of a Redstone rocket packed with 33 tons of high-explosive fuel. He had no idea that in less than 60 seconds he would be shot into the sky like a cannonball, traveling at 5,000 miles per hour. He didn't know that the Soviet Union had already lost a dog named Laika to the vacuum of space, or that the scientists watching his vitals on their monitors were deathly afraid he would never come back down alive. As the countdown reached its final breath, Ham stared at a small panel of colored lights, waiting for the only thing he understood, the signal to work. Then, the world exploded. To understand why Ham was in that capsule, you have to understand the desperation of the 1960s. The space race wasn't just about science. It was about survival. But humans didn't know if the brain could even think while weightless. Would the heart stop? Would the eyes lose focus? Ham was selected from a group of 40 candidates at Halleman Air Force Base because he was extraordinarily calm. While other chimps panicked during the loud simulations, Ham stayed focused. For 2 years, he was subjected to the G-Whiz, a massive centrifuge that spun him until his skin pulled back from his teeth. He was placed in vacuum chambers that sucked the air out of the room. He was taught a complex game. When a blue light flashes, push the right lever. When a white light flashes, push the left. Success meant a single banana pellet. Failure meant a tiny, sharp puff of air to the soles of his feet. By launch day, Ham's reflexes were faster than a human pilot's. But as the Redstone rocket cleared the gantry at Cape Canaveral, everything that could go wrong did. A relay valve in the malfunctioned. Instead of a smooth ascent, the engines burned too hot, screaming with a ferocity that terrified the engineers on the ground. The capsule was suddenly flying much higher and much faster than it was ever designed to handle. Inside, the pressure began to drop. The G-forces climbed to a staggering 14.7 Gs. Imagine the weight of an elephant sitting on your chest. That is what Ham felt. His heart rate tripled. His lungs struggled to expand. On the ground, the telemetry lines on the monitors began to jitter and flatline. The room went silent. The lead scientist whispered, "We're losing him." The capsule was now 157 miles above the Earth, deep in the blackness of space, and Ham was experiencing a level of physical trauma that no primate had ever survived. In that silence, the mission shifted from a scientific test to a tragedy in the making. But there was one man in mission control who refused to look away. Edward Dittmer, Ham's primary handler. Eid hadn't just trained Ham, he had raised him. He knew that Ham loved being tickled under the chin, and that he had a specific way of reaching out for Eid's hand when he felt unsure. To the generals, Ham was Subject 65. They gave him a number instead of a name because they didn't want the public to get attached if he died. But to Eid, he was Ham. As the capsule entered the eerie, weightless silence of orbit, the data suddenly flickered back to life. Against all odds, Ham was awake. And more than that, he was working. Despite the crushing 14 Gs, despite the oxygen levels dropping, and despite the fact that he was floating in a way that should have caused total vestibular collapse, Ham saw the blue light flash on his panel. With a trembling, furry hand, he reached out. Click. He hit the lever within 2 seconds. He wasn't doing it for the banana pellet. At that speed, the feeding mechanism had jammed anyway. He was doing it because of the bond he shared with the people on the ground. He had been taught that this was the game. And even in the face of death, Ham was holding up his end of the bargain. He was fighting for his life, and in doing so, he was proving to the world that a mind could function in the stars. The most dangerous part of the journey was the return. Because the rocket had overshot its mark, the capsule hit the atmosphere at a jagged, steep angle. It was like skipping a stone across water, except the stone was on fire. The heat shield glowed white-hot, and the interior of the capsule became an oven. The parachutes finally deployed, and the capsule slammed into the Atlantic Ocean. But it was 130 miles away from the recovery ships. The impact was so violent that it damaged the heat shield valve. Seawater began to pour into the capsule. For 3 hours, Ham bobbed in the heavy swells, the dark Atlantic slowly filling his tiny metal prison. By the time the recovery helicopter spotted the craft, it was tilted at a dangerous angle, half submerged. The divers jumped into the water, fearing the worst. They winched the dripping heavy capsule onto the deck of the USS Donner. The ship's crew stood in a somber circle. No one spoke. The technicians stepped forward, their hands shaking as they turned the heavy bolts of the hatch. They expected to find a drowned, broken animal, a sacrifice to the Cold War. The seal broke with a loud hiss. A gallon of seawater spilled onto the deck. The technicians peered inside. At first, they saw nothing but shadows and wet wire. Then, two bright, intelligent eyes blinked back at them. The gasp moment didn't come because he was alive. It came from what happened next. As Dittmer reached in to unstrap the harness, Ham didn't scream. He didn't bite. He looked at the crowd of sailors and scientists, bared his teeth in a massive, wide-eyed grin, the famous chimpanzee expression of intense relief, and reached out to grab Dittmer's hand. But here is the detail that was kept secret for years. When they finally got Ham out and offered him a celebratory apple, he took it, but he flatly refused to go back near the capsule. He had done his job. He had survived the impossible, and he was telling the world in his own way that his journey was over. He had mastered the void, and he had the data to prove it. Ham's bravery changed the course of human history in a single afternoon. Because his brain had functioned perfectly under 14 GS, NASA had the confidence to move forward. Just 3 months later, Alan Shepard climbed into a nearly identical capsule. He knew he would be safe because a 3-year-old chimp from Cameroon had survived at first. But what happened to our hero? Ham became a global icon. He was on the cover of magazines, and children across the world wrote him letters. But the most beautiful part of his story is where it ended. After years of being a pioneer, Ham was moved to the North Carolina Zoo. For the first time in his life, the sensors were taken off. The wires were gone. The blinking lights were replaced by the rustle of leaves and the warmth of the sun. He was introduced to a colony of other chimps, and keepers say he quickly became a leader, not because of his fame, but because of his gentle spirit. He spent his final years lounging in the grass, grooming his friends, and finally living the life nature had intended for him. Ham passed away on the 19th of January, 1983. He was buried at the International Space Hall of Fame, where his grave is marked with a simple, dignified plaque. He never understood the physics of his flight. He didn't know he was a hero of the Cold War. But in the silence of the upper atmosphere, when the world was screaming and his heart was racing, he stayed calm. He showed us that the first step to the stars wasn't taken by a man with a PhD or a test pilot with a silver suit. It was taken by a small, brave soul who just wanted to do a good job for the people he loved. Whenever you look at a rocket launch today, or see a photo of an astronaut on the moon, remember the name Ham. He didn't speak our language, but he told us everything we needed to know about the universe.